All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Judgment Day has arrived for the college football playoff and arguably for one of the few times since the indoctrination of this tournament, there is some huge controversy. The field of four is set as Michigan and Alabama will meet in the Rose Bowl, while Washington and Texas will get it on in the Sugar Bowl. And as the committee came to this quartet, it resulted in some disappointed people in both Athens, Georgia, and Tallahassee, Florida. Now, the Georgia Bulldogs are the two-time defending national champions, and they've been the top-ranked team in the land for the bulk of the season. But Georgia lost yesterday for the first time in nearly 2 years as they were done in by the Alabama Crimson Tide in the SEC championship game. For Florida State, they've been in the top 10 for the entire season, while they capped off an undefeated regular season last night with a win over Louisville in the ACC championship game. But this team has not been viewed the same since they lost quarterback Jordan Travis a couple of weeks ago. But both Florida State and Georgia are more than deserving to be included in this playoff. But this has been a very unique college football season, which is something that honestly the folks in Athens or Tallahassee really don't want to hear right now. Now, historically, when a top ranked team loses to another team that is ranked in the top 10, especially in a tight game like it was last night between Alabama and Georgia, they'll fall to maybe three spots in the rankings, which is something that Georgia was hoping for. And in the case of Florida State, no Power Five conference champion who had finished the regular season unblemished had not been included in the playoff. But all of that has changed now. Now, undefeated Michigan and undefeated Washington were no brainers for the playoff. But the apple cart was upset yesterday, and I've actually been talking about this for a couple of weeks now on here. When Alabama knocked off Georgia, and I said, what would happen if that were to be the case? The Crimson Tide were ranked eighth coming into this weekend, but following their win over the Bulldogs, both Alabama and Georgia were now 12-1. However, it was Alabama who was the SEC champion, while Georgia was left to hope for an at large bid. And as Alabama had just knocked off the top dog, no pun intended, their controversy started as it became a package deal. Because if you were going to take Alabama, you're going to have to take Texas because Texas just won the Big 12. Like Alabama, they're 12-1, but then also they beat Alabama this year in Tuscaloosa. So it's one of those where, for Florida State, they just wrapped up an undefeated season. But what's being held against them? Obviously, the Jordan Travis injury, as well as the fact that, from one to five, if we're ranking conferences from top to bottom, the ACC, you can make a very compelling argument that they were the weakest of the Power Five conferences this year. It's not going to be fair to Georgia and Florida State, but in my opinion, the committee did get it right. Now, you have to ask yourself right now, is Florida State one of the best four teams in the nation without Jordan Travis? And the answer is no. Obviously, if Jordan Travis is there, we're not having this conversation. And even though that Alabama won the SEC, we're probably talking about Alabama sitting at home right now. And of course, the folks in Tuscaloosa would be raising sand right now because they would be ticked off. But when it comes down to it, because I know some people want to use the example from Ohio State about a decade ago. And this is where the initial controversy started in the first round of the college football playoff. We saw Ohio State jump both TCU and Baylor, coming down the stretch in those days, the Big 12 didn't have a championship game. Also, on top of that, Ohio State had to go to a third string quarterback in Cardell Jones. And of course, the Buckeyes got into the playoff and went on to win the national championship. Different scenario that time. We saw Ohio State destroy a ranked Wisconsin team in the Big Ten championship game that year, 59 to nothing. They then got into the playoff. They ran over Alabama, and then they destroyed Oregon to win it all. This time around, we've had two games for Florida State without Jordan Travis. Obviously, he got injured early on in that game against North Alabama. They went on to win. But the Florida game, in Gainesville. And this was a Florida team that finished with a losing record. This was a Florida team that was starting a freshman quarterback in that contest that was just making his first start. And Florida State had to come back and fight, scrap, and claw to win that game. And then last night against Louisville in the ACC championship game, it was not pretty on offense. And honestly, it was this defense of Florida State that carried them to the win. Now, getting back to the ACC factor, you look at Louisville last night, and I guarantee you there was a bulk of people that were watching college football this year, and they weren't paying attention to Louisville until either they found out that Louisville clinched a spot in the ACC championship game, or when they saw Louisville take the field last night for the ACC championship game. That just gives you an idea of the strength of the ACC from top to bottom in comparison to the other Power Five conferences this year. You look at it. I see Florida State right now, and it makes me think about the 2000 Cincinnati Bearcats in football. Cincinnati was dominating everyone that year until the Conference USA tournament when All American Kenyon Martin broke his leg. And that really changed the scope of everything. Seeding for the Bearcats, they could not get out of the second round. And a lot of people feel that that Cincinnati team would have won the national championship if Kenyon Martin had not gotten hurt. And I liken this scenario with Florida State to that Kenyon Martin scenario with Cincinnati nearly 25 years ago. Now, for Georgia, the excuse is going to be that they don't play anyone. That's been the excuse for the last couple of years because obviously the SEC East does not compare to the SEC West. Georgia did play some good teams this season. They beat a tough Missouri team at home. They ran through a good Ole Miss team at home, and they beat a good Tennessee team in Knoxville, and they did it in dominating fashion. But I think again, what's going to hurt them is the fact that such a unique year because you had Michigan right behind them. Okay, so obviously Michigan's going to bump up. You had or Washington rather, and Washington's a two seed. You can make a very compelling case that you could say, hey, maybe Washington could be the one seed, being that they just beat a Oregon team that was in the top five, and they beat them twice this year. Okay, but nonetheless, you got to put Georgia behind them. Then this is where the real controversy begins because obviously Oregon was going to drop. Ohio State was in a no-win scenario once they lost yesterday. So that left Florida State. It left Alabama, who was going to move up after knocking off Georgia. And then it also left Texas, who was going to move up after they destroyed Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State was ranked, but obviously, Oklahoma State, we knew that Texas were going to beat the brakes off of them in the Big 12 championship game. But nonetheless, you knew both of those teams were going to move up. And again, it comes back to the package deal aspect. If you took Alabama, you're going to have to take Texas. And unfortunately for Florida State and Georgia, they were on the other side of that equation. Now, the proponents for expanding the playoff from 4 teams to 12 teams are going to have a field day now because they're going to say, hey, this is why we need to expand the playoff because Georgia deserves to be there. Florida State deserves to be there as well. I got news for you, though. If you expanded the playoff from 12 teams to 20 teams, it doesn't matter. There would be a 13th team, there would be a 21st team that is going to have a beef and say, hey, you know what? What about us? We've seen this before. You look at the NCAA tournament, there's always one or two teams on that bubble that feel like they deserve to be in the tournament. They didn't get there. You go back to the days pre BCS when it was just one team that was awarded the national championship. There was always at least one team that had a gripe. When we got to the BCS, there was always that third team that had a legitimate gripe. Now with the 14 playoff, more often than not, there's a 15 that has a gripe. And I guarantee you, with the 12-team playoff, there's going to be a 13 team that says, hey, we should have been in. Now, I know that the Florida State fans, and I know that Florida State is going to be upset, and they have every single right to be. But even with the expanded playoff, being a conference champion does not guarantee you a seat at the table. And I think obviously this year is a clear example of that. And it's going to be an issue going forward. I guarantee you. Why? Because once we get to this 12-team playoff, this tournament is going to be dominated by the Big Ten and the SEC. I mean, you look at the SEC going forward with this playoff. You know, Alabama's going to be in that mix. You know, Texas is going to be in that mix. You got LSU, you got Georgia. These four teams, and we're not even talking about the rest of that league, they're going to be consistently in that mix. Then when you flip it over to the Big Ten, you got Michigan, you got Penn State, you got Ohio State, Oregon, who's joining that league, Washington, USC. So when it's all said and done, ACC, Big 12, we don't know what's going to come of the Pac 2 or whatever. And, everybody else is going to be fighting for, a couple of spots. So, it's unfortunate, but you got to get used to it. It's one of those, again, it's a unique year for college football, and it sucks for both Florida State and Georgia because Georgia still has a championship worthy team. Obviously, they're not in the tournament. And, Florida State's going to sit back and say, and rightfully so, we should be there and we're being penalized because we don't have our quarterback. Now, college football is always going to have controversy. This ain't the first time. And I guarantee you that it's not going to be the last. But I mean, just for the sake of argument, we've seen what Florida State looks like without Jordan Travis. How much of a chance with Florida State right now on a neutral field are you giving them against Michigan? Are you giving them against Alabama, Texas, or Washington? It really wouldn't look good. This is going to be a very unique playoff, and I'll touch more on it as we get closer to the tournament. But this is one of the few times where you could say all four of these teams have a legit chance to win it all. It's going to be very interesting because you look at it, that Rose Bowl, that's going to be a game where you know what? One of these teams obviously is going to win. One of them is going to be in the national championship game. But that Rose Bowl is going to give everybody somebody, or most people at least, somebody to cheer against because you're going to have people that don't want to see Alabama there. They're in it. And then you're going to have people that don't want to see Michigan advance because of the sign stealing scandal. Things really changed, obviously, with the Georgia loss because we were looking at the possibility of a Big Ten Pac-12 meeting traditionally, and excuse me, in the Rose Bowl with Michigan and Oregon. Obviously, that's not the case. Michigan and Washington, excuse me, that's not the case. As you know, Washington is now going to the Sugar Bowl, and honestly, I'll touch on this as we get closer to the game. They're going to be at a slight disadvantage because they're playing Texas, and obviously, Austin is closer to New Orleans than Seattle is, and it's one of those where you couldn't put Michigan against Alabama in the Sugar Bowl because Michigan's a top seed. But nonetheless, obviously, if you put Michigan in the Sugar Bowl, that's a hop, skip, and a jump from Tuscaloosa. So either way, it was a tough scenario for the committee in that aspect. It was tough all around, but honestly, this is why the committee gets paid the big bucks to make these tough decisions. Some people are going to still be upset with this. Some people are probably going to disagree with what I'm saying right now. It's all good. I understand it. But at the end of the day, the committee got it right. We're going to a 12-team playoff soon, but it's not going to stop the controversy in college football. So, folks, that's going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the Sports Discussion Group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now, you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So, once again, fine folks, My name is William Martin, and I am signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.